The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Iowa.
Welcome to Iowa Insights. I'm Ron Steele. I'm a 1973 graduate of the University of Iowa, but I'm here today to interview our very special guest, Mr. Tom Brokaw of NBC News. Tom began his college education right here in Iowa City at the University of Iowa, eventually graduating from the University of South Dakota with a degree in political science. Tom began working for NBC within 4 years after his college graduation and has remained there his entire professional career, receiving many, if not all, of the highest honors of his profession. Mr. Brokaw has been a longtime supporter and friend to the University of Iowa, and in May 2010, he returned to the campus to receive an honorary doctorate and deliver the commencement address. Well, Tom, it's always great to see you back in Iowa City. I know you spent 1 year here back in the late 1950s. You talk about that in your book, but you didn't graduate from the University of Iowa, but you still have this tremendous passion. Where does that originate?
Well, I think I've spent the last 50 years trying to make up for that year. I have an enormous affection for University of Iowa and the state of Iowa because I've spent so much time here. I even lived here for a time when I was in high school and then later in college, not just in Iowa City, but also in Sioux City. And this is the true heartland. I have obviously much deeper roots in South Dakota, which I still feel very attached to. But that's the beginning of the Great Plains. Here in Iowa, I drove across it today, the rich farmland, the wind farms in the north, the tidy towns, the whole idea of renewal here in the springtime every year. And it's reassuring to me, frankly, when I come back, to see how people are getting on with their lives. They're not engaged in some of the food fights that are going on in Washington, D.C., or the clatter that you hear on cable television. So I always go back with a renewed sense of how great this country is and how important it is that we have places like Iowa.
Growing up in Yankton, South Dakota, that shaped pretty much all your views of life and made you the type of person who I think a lot of people do believe in you. They trust you, they respect your work because you're so modest, for one thing, and because you are such a professional. How did growing up in a small town shape who we are?
Well, I grew up in a working class family, and at the end of the day, you were always measured by what you had accomplished that day. And it had to be tangible. My father used to tease me about, he didn't think that he'd ever raise a son who made his living putting on makeup and reading out loud, because my father carried a lunchbox, and he operated heavy equipment, and he overhauled cars on weekends for a hobby. And there wasn't anything in our house that we needed that he said, I can build that. And finally, my mother stopped saying, I need a new ironing board, because she wanted to go buy one out of a store at some point. So I was always conscious of that. And then in the small towns and even in the cities of the Midwest, people take the measure of you. They're there to help you. These communities are really the villages that raise everyone, I think. When you come to the Midwest, there's enormous pride in the high school and the people who are excelling there, and they're for you. But if you begin to wander off the straight and narrow a little bit, there's always someone, it may not be your parents necessarily, it's got their finger raised and said, better get back in line. We're watching. We're all in this together. So I think that had a big impact on me. And on big stories, I'm often very conscious of how the people on Main Street in Yankton are going to respond to this. When I was 16 years old, I was working on an election night at the little radio station in Yankton. I went out to get the ballots to get the count from a rural school district so I could rush back to the radio station, put it on the air. And every night on election night, when I sit down with all the NBC apparatus around me, the entire country looking in, and kind of the command of this enormous ship, I think back to that night when I was 16. I think, I had as much fun that night as I'm probably going to have tonight.
You addressed the commencement in May of 2010. You talked about failure being an option, which was part of your book, the 11th chapter of your book, where you talked a lot about being here.
The University of Iowa was an instructive experience for me. I came out of high school a real whiz kid and then crashed and burned here for 9 months. And I still don't understand completely why I did. I was kind of bedazzled by all that was going on here and spent more time in the distractions of Iowa City than I did in the business at hand. So I have worn that failure almost every day for the rest of my life. It was very instructive to have that happen to me at that age because I learned how quickly things can go wrong. And sometimes it's not as easy to recover as you think that it might be. It took me a couple of years to pull out of that nosedive. And it's been very helpful to me in building the career that I have because I've since then have stayed on a path that is pretty industrious, I think. I've worked very hard and tried to build one accomplishment after another because I always think to myself, Iowa happened, it could happen again.
You know, as you think about it, your experience here at the University of Iowa and then graduating from South Dakota, and we talk about the role of education. You know, Eddie Robinson, the great Grambling coach, I remember hearing him say something like that. No matter how much you know or how much you think you know or how much other people think you never know enough, because he wanted his players to use education as the springboard. What is the role of education today in 2010?
Well, it's more critical than ever before, and I was thinking about this ceremony at the University of Iowa, another commencement in this great public university that serves the state and the nation so well. There is no other place in the world where as many young people get a higher education as they do in the United States from all these institutions, most of them public, but a lot of them private. And this ceremony is going on across the country. And that positions us to deal with a global environment in which we're now living. You know, there was a time when we were Fortress America, but we're now competing not just against Europe as we once did, but we're competing against Asia, China, India, and Southeast Asia, South Vietnam, and all the so-called tigers that are out there. And the big leg up that we have is that we have this tradition of higher education in America, turning out engineers and physicians and people in the humanities and the arts, and no other country or society in the history of the world has made that available to as many people as we do.
You're supposed to be retired, but it looks to me like you're busier than ever doing these documentaries. You're traveling across the country on this great highway. It looks like you're having more fun now, perhaps, than ever before. Is that the case?
Well, I think retirement was the wrong word. I was always going to shift gears, but I didn't think I was going to shift into a higher gear. I am working a lot because the assignments are irresistible. Highway 50 going across the country. I did a 2-hour documentary on the baby boomers. I was in Vancouver for the sports department. I was going to do one little tiny piece for them. I ended up doing a number of them because I have an enormous affection for Dick Ebersol and that great crew and what they are able to do at the Olympics. I'm on a number of boards, so that keeps me busy and engaged. I passed a big birthday this year, and I found it a little hard to believe that I have to write that number, 7-0, down somewhere. So I think the way I'm countermanding it is just by getting up and pedaling pretty hard.
People ask me all the time about stories that I've covered, but in your case, it's just exponentially at a higher level. The Berlin Wall, interviewing Mr. Gorbachev, I remember. Could you pinpoint a couple of key moments in your career that maybe changed your worldview?
Well, I've kind of tried to consolidate them into just a few. I think the first most important story that I covered was the assassination of John Kennedy, but I was only doing that in the Omaha area, but it had such a national impact. I remember driving out to the Strategic Air Command headquarters that day to see if they were on extra alert, because we didn't know what had happened. We only knew that the president was dead. We didn't know who was responsible at that point. And as I drove out there at the age of 23, I thought, this is going to change us. This is going to be a different country as a result of that. I was thinking that intuitively, and in fact, it did change us. And then after that, the big stories were 1968 and all that went wrong in America. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Dr. King, who had liberated this country from racism. Civil rights movement was another one of those great hallmarks of my reporting career. The riots in Chicago, 15,000 people died in Vietnam that year. I was a White House correspondent during Watergate. But I think if I were to stand back and say, okay, what are the really big stories? The single hardest story I had to cover was 9/11 because it was so unexpected and we were out there without a net, you know, on the air 24/7, trying to keep pace with what was going on, trying to deal with the emotional trauma the country was feeling. And then standing back a little more, I think 1,000 years from now, historians will look back and say the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of communist oppression and all those Soviet satellites was an epic event in our time, and I had the privilege of being in the middle of that, interviewing Gorbachev, being in Czechoslovakia, being in Poland. So, you know, I was thinking driving in here today, when I was 18 years old at the University of Iowa, I had no idea that my life would unfold the way that it has.
When you think about your years here and all the success that you've had, what stands out as something that you'd like people to remember about you? You lost a couple of really good friends in the last few years, in Tim Russert, Peter Jennings. Does that in some way make you think a little bit about your own mortality and how you would like people to remember you?
Yeah, there was a party for me in Vancouver during the Winter Olympics because of my 70th birthday, and I had just finished an essay on Canada and the relationship between the United States and Canada, and I included deliberately in that essay the Canadian exports to us that we can all be, we're all better off for in this country. Marty Short is one of them,
Sure.
Obviously Dan Aykroyd, and I made a point of very prominently displaying Peter's picture in that. And his family members are very close to me at this point, and they all got in touch and said we were so touched by that, and Peter would have been as well. And I said to my friends who were there at the party, I then realized that Peter was 67 when he died. I'll never again complain about being 70 because I got to go on with my life. And that makes me very conscious of how fragile life can be. I think on two counts. Something that I'm grateful for is that over the course of my career, I mostly got it right, not every time. But as I look back on the big stories and on the small, I worked very hard at getting it right. And the audience seemed to respond to that. Writing The Greatest Generation was probably the most important thing I did in my professional life in many ways. I gave a voice to that generation, gave it a name as well. But then finally, without question, for me, the most important part of my life has been my family. My wife and my 3 daughters are the most accomplished women, and they don't, the idea that their father or husband is in some small way a celebrity, that has no impact on them whatsoever. In fact, quite the contrary.
Let's talk a little bit about, you said failure is an option when you spoke to the University of Iowa graduating class of 2010. What does that mean to you today, and how does that play into their lives as they look toward these bright futures that they have?
Well, first of all, I don't want them to be embarrassed by failure, because in one form or another it happens to everyone. We hope in smaller doses rather than larger doses. But the test of character is how you respond to it. Whether you acknowledge it, take responsibility for it, and then make a comeback from it. I've been collecting stories about people who have failed over the years. A lot of people don't realize that Dick Cheney flunked out of Yale 3 times. I always say, you were 2 up on me. And there are lots of cases like that. Take Bodie Miller. Bodie Miller in the last Olympics went 0 for 5 in medals. And a lot of people said he was too old and too arrogant to make the comeback. He goes off to Vancouver, gets a silver, gold, and bronze. So, you know, it's a test of character, failure, and we're all going to bump up against it. A number of my friends that I had when I was here at Iowa, who watched me have a very good time and not make any kind of a distinguished mark academically, wondered what was going on, and then said to me 20 years later, you know, you got it out of the way at the right time. It happened to me 10 years after I graduated. I kind of went off the rails for a while, or I had a huge problem at work that was all my fault, and I was not equipped to deal with it very well. So I learned to deal with it early, and I just want everybody to be aware that it does happen. And when it does happen to you, then you have a responsibility to straighten it out and to learn from it. And when it happens to someone who's a friend of yours, the other lesson is you have a responsibility to be there for them.
Exactly. I guess they say there's no shame in falling down, but it's the only shame would be in not trying to get back up, something like that.
That's right.
These students today, they have such incredible talent. I mean, what's ahead for them, and where do we as journalists fit into that as far as telling their stories for the future?
Well, I think about that a lot. I'm trying to write a book about it, in fact, about the challenges of this generation, which are so different. It's a much more crowded planet. When you and I came of age, television news was relatively new, and there were a lot of jobs, and they were good jobs. And no one said it might go away at some point. That's not true anymore in journalism. You know, it's a shifting environment. A lot of it's gone digital now. Newspapers, which we always thought would be with us forever, are fighting for their lives economically. Young people are not competing just against each other in this country. They're competing against 23 million Chinese and technological institutes at the moment. India is in a great race to catch up with the rest of the world. So they've got their work cut out for them. But what I'm going to say to them at Iowa is, it could not be more exciting for your generation. What a wonderful challenge. Look at the greatest generation. Look at all the challenges they faced. And because they measured up and did not shirk from their responsibility, they left a lasting imprint on the world. And there's something kind of exciting about that.
When you think about what's happening here in Iowa City, the great writers' workshop that everyone knows about, the Pulitzer Prize winners, and like Z.Z. Packer, we see her book here right in this library where we are, and some of the great writers who have been here, what areas do you think universities should focus on as we move into the next century?
Well, science is the key to the future, and it doesn't mean we have to turn out James Van Allen's every 4 years here, but we're going to require a more scientifically educated society as we go forward, not just to compete in the industrial age or against Asia and China. People need to have the fundamental elements of science to make decisions about their lives now, because so much of the technology is new and we need to know how it operates. We had a big discussion at the Mayo Clinic board, where I'm now a member, about wellness and taking responsibility for your health. And you have to know more about human biology to do that, because we can't have a population that just keeps tripping into chronic diseases like cardiac conditions and diabetes. We're going to have to work harder at making ourselves healthier so that we can afford the care that a society like this deserves. So I think science is a big piece of it, but you can't lose sight of the humanities and literature and the richness that they bring to our lives. I just made a speech recently that I said to a group of young writers saying, tweet is a verb, but writing is forever. And I read to them some of my favorite passages from Shakespeare, for example. And they were kind of wide-eyed, because it was, I said, remember, he wrote this in 1599 about war. And think of how vital it still is when you read it. So, a well-educated society has a broad spectrum of interests, and we need to continue to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening here at the University of Iowa. We've had some tremendous presidents in recent years. Mary Sue Coleman, now at Michigan. David Skorton out at Cornell. Now Sally Mason is the president. They're doing a terrific job under some very, very tight budget situations. Does that concern you as far as education here at the university and other great schools around the country?
It does, but I think institutions of higher education, like everything else in America now, is in play because of this economic downturn. I actually wrote something in the New York Times, and I did hear from some Iowans who weren't happy about it. I wasn't just picking on Iowa, but I picked on South Dakota, North Dakota, I picked on New York, I picked on California. We have to look at new efficiencies. Iowa has 99 counties, 99 courthouses. Iowa has, some school consolidation at the public level, but there's a lot more that probably is going to have to be done. I mean, these are hard calls to make, I know, but we've got to find ways to save money so that the resources that we do have are used as efficiently as possible. And a lot of our government structure, not just in Iowa, this is true across the country, it was designed for horse and buggy days. You had 99 counties because farmers could only get 8 miles to the county courthouse, and that was a long trip for them. That's no longer the case. South Dakota and North Dakota have between them 17 institutions of higher learning. If they consolidated some of that, it would be a lot better. New York has 11,000 state agencies, and no one even knows what all of them do at this point. So we've got some hard calls to make, and higher education ought to be one of the places where we want to make our greatest investments.
Right.
Most of the public universities in America are enormous treasures to this country. You have the young people from the state and from out of state coming to a place, and their only responsibility is to get an education so that they can continue to improve the society in which they live. It took me a little while to catch on to that, but when I did, to this day, I just drove through Iowa City today, and I thought, what was I thinking? What a wonderful place this was. Now, I took advantage of a lot of lectures. I love the library. I'd go up into the library into the rare stacks. I just wasn't showing up in the classes that I should have been and doing some of the work that I ought to have done. But the people of Iowa should have enormous pride in this institution and in Iowa State and all the other state schools for that matter, because it's not just football weekends. This is a legacy that you're providing for your children, for their children, and for the future of this country. We're going to move forward into the 21st century, and we'll still be, I believe, the dominant society in the world because of our higher education system. And almost everyone I know at senior levels in American life, whether it's Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or any of the women who are now becoming recognized, Kathy Sebelius, who's the Secretary of Health and Welfare, the former governor of Kansas, they all say the same thing. Education got us to where we are, and it will continue to take us into the future if we keep that in focus and at the forefront of our minds.
Tom Brokaw, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you.
Great to see you again.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Iowa in association with the Big Ten Network.